I have always loved solo camping. The solitude, the quiet, the complete disconnection from the rest of the world. It always felt like a reset button on life. That was until one particular trip that changed how I felt about being alone in the wilderness forever. It was early September when I decided to go camping in the Pacific Northwest, deep in one of the national forests, known for its thick, seemingly endless woods. I had been to this area a few times before, but never this deep into the forest. The plan was simple: 2 nights alone, hiking, fishing, and unwinding. I had all my gear, food, and a reliable map. The first day was uneventful. I hiked about 6 miles from my truck into the woods and set up camp in a small clearing near a narrow creek. The location was perfect: plenty of firewood, a water source, and no sign of other campers anywhere nearby. The afternoon passed peacefully as I gathered firewood, set up my small tent, and cooked a simple meal over the fire. As night fell, the temperature dropped slightly, and the dense trees made the darkness feel absolute. I settled into my sleeping bag, listening to the familiar sounds of the wilderness: the distant hoot of an owl, the rustling of small animals in the underbrush, the gentle flow of the creek nearby. Everything felt normal, until I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I stayed completely still, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting a weak orange glow against the trees. It was eerily silent. No wind, no crickets, no owls, just dead silence. Then I heard it. A twig snapped, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps just outside my camp. Slow, deliberate. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps weren't from a 4-legged animal. They were too methodical, too careful. They sounded like a person trying to move quietly, but stepping on dry branches and leaves. My first thought was that maybe another camper had wandered into my sight by accident, but no one should have been out here. I was miles from the nearest trailhead, and I hadn't seen a single person all day. I reached for my flashlight, but stopped. If it was an animal, I didn't want to startle it into attacking. If it was a person, I didn't want to give away that I was awake. I lay there, forcing myself to breathe as quietly as possible. The footsteps circled my tent, moving slowly, deliberately, as if whoever, or whatever, was out there was studying my camp. Then the steps stopped, right behind my tent. I gripped the handle of my knife, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it would give me away. The presence lingered, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I could feel it. My mind raced. Should I call out? Should I make a noise? Should I sit up and shine my light outside? After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved again. This time, they retreated, slowly fading into the woods. I stayed completely still for another hour, barely daring to breathe. Finally, exhaustion won out, and at some point, I drifted back to sleep. When morning came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside cautiously. The forest was alive again, birds chirping, the rustling of squirrels in the trees, the wind moving through the leaves. Everything felt normal again, except for one thing. There were no footprints. The ground was covered in soft dirt and fallen leaves, but there was nothing. No sign of any disturbance. No proof that anyone or anything had been walking around my camp the night before. I tried to shake off the unease and convinced myself that maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my half-awake brain had misinterpreted the sounds of the forest. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had not been alone. The second day went by in a blur. I spent most of it fishing at the creek, trying to distract myself from the previous night. But as the sun started to set, my nerves returned. The forest that had seemed so peaceful by day now felt oppressive, the trees too dense, the shadows too deep. I built a larger fire that night, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there at bay. I forced myself to eat, though my stomach felt tight with unease. As night fell, I kept my flashlight in my lap and my knife within easy reach. I didn't have to wait long. Just past midnight, the footsteps returned. Slow, measured, circling my camp. I held my breath, gripping my knife so tightly my hand ached. The firelight cast flickering shadows against the trees, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped just beyond the reach of the light. Then I heard breathing. Not the distant snuffling of an animal, but deep, slow, human breathing. Controlled. Purposeful. Someone was standing just out of sight, watching me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it directly toward the sound. Nothing. The woods were empty. But I knew someone had been there. The breathing had been real. The footsteps had been real. And now, whoever it was, they knew I was afraid. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat up with my knife in my hand, jumping at every rustling leaf, every creaking branch. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I packed up my camp in record time. I had planned to stay another night, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't spend another minute in those woods. As I hiked back toward my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed different now, less welcoming, more suffocating. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear into the back and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors before I even caught my breath. I never went back to that forest, and I never camp alone anymore. Camping had always been a tradition for our group. Every summer, we picked a remote location, packed our gear, and headed out into the wilderness. This year, we wanted something different, someplace untouched, away from the usual trails and crowded campsites. We found an old map online that marked a small lake deep within a national park. It was off the main trails, but accessible with some effort. Perfect. There were 5 of us, me, Jake, Chris, Maria, and Sam. We were all experienced campers, ready for an adventure. We hiked most of the day, winding through dense trees and rough terrain. The air smelled of pine, and the occasional distant bird call was the only sound besides our footsteps. After hours of trekking, we found the lake. It was breathtaking, crystal clear water reflecting the sky, surrounded by towering trees that seemed untouched by time. It was exactly what we had hoped for. We set up camp, pitching our tents near the water. The night was calm, the fire crackling as we shared stories and roasted marshmallows. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. But something changed the next morning. Maria was the first to notice. She had gone to retrieve our food from the tree, where we had hung it to keep it away from animals. But when she returned, she looked pale. "Guys, our tracks from yesterday, they're gone." At first, we laughed it off. "Maybe the wind covered them?" Jake suggested. But Maria shook her head. "It rained last night, but that should have made them more distinct, not erased them. It's like we were never here." We spread out, searching for any sign of our arrival. The trampled grass, the snapped branches from when we had gathered firewood. Nothing. It was as if we had never set foot here. Even the ashes from our fire had disappeared. The only sign of our presence was our tents and gear. An unsettling feeling crept in. "This is weird," Chris muttered, kicking at the damp earth where our footprints should have been. "Really weird." We tried to shake it off and continued with our morning. But as we packed up to leave, we faced another problem. We couldn't find the trail we had come in on. "We came from that direction, right?" Sam pointed to the dense trees. "No, I'm pretty sure it was over there," Maria countered, pointing in the opposite direction. Confusion set in fast. We had all been sure of our path the day before, but now the landscape looked unfamiliar. The trees were indistinguishable, no landmarks to guide us. We split up into pairs to search for any sign of the trail, marking our path back to camp as we went. But after an hour, all we found was more unbroken wilderness. The realization hit us like a punch. We were lost. Jake, always the rational one, pulled out his GPS. "We'll just find our coordinates and retrace our steps." He frowned as he stared at the screen. "That's not possible." "What?" I asked. "The GPS says we're somewhere else. It's showing we're miles away from where we should be." We huddled around, staring at the screen. It showed us deep inside the park, much farther than we should have been. It made no sense. "Maybe there's interference," Maria suggested. "Maybe," Jake said, but he didn't sound convinced. With no other option, we decided to pick a direction and walk. We knew there was a road somewhere to the east, so we moved that way, marking trees as we went. But after another hour, something terrifying happened. We stumbled back into our own campsite. At first, we thought it was a different spot, but everything was exactly as we had left it. Our footprints from where we had just walked gone. It was as if we had never left. Panic set in. "This isn't right," Chris whispered, his voice tight with fear. "It's like we're stuck." We spent the next few hours trying again and again, choosing different directions, but no matter what, we always ended up back at the lake. By late afternoon, exhaustion and fear weighed heavily on us. We decided to stay one more night and try again in the morning. That night was different. The peaceful silence we had enjoyed before now felt oppressive. The fire flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move unnaturally. Every sound made us jump. None of us spoke much. We were all thinking the same thing. We were trapped, and we didn't know why. At some point during the night, I woke up to a strange noise. A whisper. It was faint, almost like the wind, but there was something off about it. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to hear. It came again, from somewhere near the trees. A soft, unintelligible murmur. I shook Jake awake. "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, but the whispering had stopped. "What?" There was someone whispering. He listened for a moment, then shook his head. "Just your imagination, man. Get some sleep." But I couldn't, and I wasn't the only one. The next morning, Maria looked shaken. "I heard something last night." Whispering. Chris and Sam exchanged uneasy glances. "We did too," Chris admitted. "I thought it was one of you." We packed up in silence, our nerves frayed. This time we moved together, sticking close. But no matter what we did, we always returned to the lake. Desperation took over. Jake tried using his compass, but it spun wildly, refusing to settle. Our phones had lost all signal. It was as if the outside world had been cut off. That night, we took turns keeping watch. Around midnight, Maria, who was on watch, shook us awake. "Something's out there." We listened, and sure enough, soft footsteps circled the edge of our camp. They were slow, deliberate. Not an animal, too controlled, too precise. Then, the whispering returned, closer this time. "Go back." The words were faint but unmistakable. We grabbed our knives, our bear spray, anything that could be a weapon. The footsteps stopped. The whispering faded. The forest held its breath. We didn't sleep. At first light, we made a final desperate attempt, running in a straight line as far as we could. The trees blurred past, our legs burning. We didn't stop until we saw something ahead. A road. We stumbled onto the pavement, gasping for air. Looking back, the trees seemed normal again, the lake hidden from view. But none of us dared go back. A ranger found us an hour later, dehydrated and shaken. When we explained what had happened, he exchanged a glance with his partner. "You're not the first ones," he admitted. "That part of the park isn't on official maps anymore. People go in, but they don't always come out." We never camped together again after that trip, and none of us ever returned to that park. Some places, I've come to believe, aren't meant to be found. Or maybe they find you. I always loved solo camping. The isolation, the quiet, the feeling of being completely removed from the chaos of everyday life. It was something I cherished. I had done it dozens of times before, but nothing had ever prepared me for what happened that night. It was early autumn when I decided to take a weekend trip into the woods. The air was crisp, the trees were turning, and I figured it was my last chance before the real cold set in. I picked a remote spot in a national forest, one I had camped at a couple of times before. It wasn't a designated campground, just a clearing near a small river a few miles from the nearest trailhead. Hardly anyone came out that far, which was exactly why I liked it. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked my car at the trailhead, and hiked in. The sun hung low in the sky by the time I reached my spot, and I moved quickly to set up my tent and gather some wood for a fire. There was no wind, just the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals darted through the underbrush. The peacefulness of it all made me relax. By nightfall, I had a fire going and was enjoying a simple meal, some dehydrated food and hot tea. I stared into the flames, letting my mind drift. Around 9 o'clock, I decided to turn in for the night. I doused the fire, secured my food in a bear canister a good distance from the tent, and crawled into my sleeping bag. The sounds of the forest were comforting. Chirping crickets, distant hoots of an owl, the gentle babbling of the river nearby. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I wasn't sure why at first. I lay there for a few seconds, adjusting to the darkness, listening. Then I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching in the dry leaves outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. A deer, maybe a raccoon sniffing around. But something felt off. The steps weren't erratic or light, like an animal's movements. They were slow, steady, like a person carefully making their way through the woods. I reached for the knife I always kept inside my sleeping bag and gripped it tightly. The footsteps circled around the tent. I could hear them move from one side to the other, then stop. Silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. I forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible, my heart hammering in my chest. Then, the footsteps started again. Closer this time. I could hear them shifting through the leaves, just outside my tent, stopping right near where my head rested. Whoever, or whatever, They were standing just inches away from me. My mind raced through possibilities. A lost hiker? A hunter? But why would they be walking around a tent in the middle of the night without announcing themselves? I thought about calling out, demanding to know who was there. But something deep in my gut told me not to. Instead, I stayed still, gripping my knife so hard my knuckles ached. Minutes passed. The footsteps started again, moving slowly to the other side of the tent. Then, finally, they faded into the distance. I lay there for what felt like an eternity before I finally dared to move. I listened carefully, but the only sounds were the usual night noises. The river, the insects, the distant rustling of leaves in the breeze. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I slowly unzipped my tent and peered outside. The forest looked completely normal, serene even. But when I stepped out, my stomach dropped. There were footprints all around my tent. They were deep, distinct, and unmistakably human. They circled my tent multiple times, stopping at certain points, exactly where I had heard them. I followed them for a few yards into the trees, but they simply disappeared, as if whoever had been there had intentionally stepped back over their own tracks. A cold chill ran down my spine. I packed up as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool morning air. I never saw another person the entire hike back. I don't know who or what was outside my tent that night. I don't know what they wanted, but I do know one thing. I've never gone solo camping again. Camping had never been my thing, but when my friend Jared invited me on a weekend trip with a few of his buddies, I figured it wouldn't be so bad. Fresh air, a break from city life, a few beers by the fire. Why not? I didn't know the rest of the group well, but I trusted Jared, and he assured me it would be a good time. So, I packed a borrowed tent, some old hiking boots, and a sleeping bag that I was sure smelled like mildew, and set off into the mountains with them. There were 5 of us in total: Jared, myself, 2 of his friends, Chris and Nate, and Jared's cousin Devin. We drove for hours, leaving behind the bustling roads and trading them for winding dirt paths leading deep into the wilderness. By the time we arrived at the designated campsite, the sun had dipped below the mountains, leaving only a faint, eerie glow on the horizon. Setting up camp in the fading light wasn't ideal, but we managed. Chris and Nate shared a tent, Jared and Devin took another, and I set up my small, single-person tent a short distance away. It wasn't too far, maybe 20 feet, but far enough that I felt a little isolated. That should have been my first warning. After a dinner of grilled hot dogs and a few beers, we sat around the fire, swapping stories. Chris and Nate kept talking about an old legend of a man who had disappeared in these woods decades ago. Supposedly, his tent was found intact, but there was no sign of him. The story was eerie, but it was nothing more than campfire talk. At least, that's what I told myself. By midnight, we were all exhausted. One by one, we retreated to our tents, and the only sounds left were the distant hoots of an owl and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I had trouble sleeping. The ground was hard, the air was too still, and something about the dense forest around us felt wrong. Every little noise made me twitch. A snapping twig in the distance. The faint rustle of something moving through the underbrush. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Around 3 a.m., nature called. I groggily unzipped my tent, stepping out into the cold night. The fire had long since died down, leaving only faint embers glowing in the pit. The tents of my companions were dark, silent. I walked a short distance away, relieved myself near a tree, and started heading back. That's when I made my mistake. Still half asleep, I approached what I thought was my tent, unzipped it, and crawled inside. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of sweat and fabric. I shuffled into my sleeping bag, letting out a sigh as I sank into the familiar discomfort of the thin padding beneath me. My eyes closed, and I let exhaustion pull me back into the depths of sleep. Then something shifted beside me. My breath caught in my throat. My mind, slow and foggy, struggled to process what I had just felt. It was subtle, but unmistakable. A slight movement, the weight of another body shifting just inches away from mine. My first thought was that I had accidentally crawled into Jared's tent, but that didn't make sense. I was sure I had walked straight back to my own. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. The darkness was thick, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out a vague shape beside me. Someone was lying there, facing away, their back rising and falling with each slow breath. My stomach clenched. Who the hell was in my tent? Swallowing my fear, I whispered, "Jared?" No response. "Chris?" "Nate?" Nothing. I lay frozen, my body rigid, every nerve on high alert. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. If this wasn't one of my friends, then who was it? And then the worst thought of all struck me. Was I even in the right tent? My breathing grew shallow as I slowly, carefully, reached for the zipper. The last thing I wanted was to wake whoever was lying beside me. My fingers found the cold metal, and I began pulling it down as silently as I could. A breath. Not mine. A long, slow inhale, followed by an even slower exhale. It came from directly beside me. Whoever was in this tent wasn't asleep. My body screamed at me to run, but I knew any sudden movement could provoke something. I didn't know what. I didn't want to know. I kept pulling the zipper, inch by inch, until finally I had enough space to squeeze through. I moved carefully, sliding out, suppressing the urge to sprint the moment my feet hit the ground. My heart thundered as I turned and looked at the tent. It wasn't mine. The fabric was darker, slightly larger than the one I had set up. My tent was a few feet away, exactly where I had left it. I had crawled into a stranger's tent. But that wasn't the worst part. The zipper, the one I had just unzipped, slowly started moving back up. I didn't wait to see who or what was inside. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged with fear. I didn't stop until I reached Jared's tent, yanking it open and diving inside. "Dude, what the hell?" Jared groaned, half asleep. "There's someone out there," I gasped. "Someone's in that tent. It's not ours." Jared sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" Chris and Nate stirred in their tent. "What's going on?" Nate called groggily. "I went to the wrong tent," I said, my voice shaking. "There was someone in it, and they were awake." That woke them up fast. Jared grabbed his flashlight, unzipping the tent. We all huddled together, scanning the clearing. The tents were all there, exactly as they had been, but there was no extra tent. I walked over to where I knew I had just been. The ground was empty. No tent, no signs of anyone having camped there. "Are you messing with us?" Chris asked, his face pale. "I swear," I whispered. "It was right here. I felt them. I heard them breathe. I stopped. Because right there, in the dirt where the tent should have been, were footprints. Dozens of them, leading in every direction. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sun rose, we packed up and left. I didn't look back. None of us did. I don't know what I crawled into that night. I don't know who or what I shared that space with. And I don't want to know. All I know is that I was never supposed to be there. And neither was that tent. We had planned the trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just 4 friends looking to escape the noise of the city and enjoy some time in the wilderness. The destination was a remote campsite in the mountains, a few hours' drive from town. None of us had ever been there before, but the pictures online showed a beautiful, secluded forest with a nearby lake, perfect for hiking and fishing. The group consisted of me, my best friend Daniel, his younger brother Jake, and our mutual friend Steve. We had packed everything we needed: tents, food, sleeping bags, flashlights, and even a small portable grill. The drive was long but scenic, winding through dense forests and steep mountain passes. As we got closer to the campsite, the roads became rougher, and we had to slow down to navigate the potholes and sharp turns. About an hour before reaching our destination, we spotted a hitchhiker on the side of the road. He was a tall, lanky man in his mid-30s, wearing a tattered jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He had a backpack slung over one shoulder and was holding out his thumb. "Should we stop?" Jake asked from the back seat. "Hell no," Steve said. "We don't even know this guy." Daniel, who was driving, hesitated for a moment before pulling over. "Come on, guys. We're in the middle of nowhere. He could be stranded." I wasn't too thrilled about picking up a stranger, but I also felt a little guilty leaving him out here. He approached the car with an easy gait and leaned into the passenger window. "Hey, thanks for stopping," he said. His voice was calm, friendly even. "I'm just looking to get a few miles up the road. You guys heading toward the lake?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, we are." The man smiled. "Perfect. I was headed that way myself." Against my better judgment, we let him in. He introduced himself as Mark and didn't say much after that. He sat quietly in the back with Jake and Steve, staring out the window as the trees blurred past. Something about him put me on edge, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. After about 20 minutes, Mark asked Daniel to pull over near an old trailhead. "This is my stop," he said, grabbing his backpack. "Thanks again for the ride." "No problem," Daniel replied. "You camping out here?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, something like that." Then, without another word, he turned and walked into the woods. We watched him go, disappearing between the trees like a ghost. "Well, that was weird," Steve muttered as we drove off. I agreed. Something about Mark didn't sit right with me. We reached our campsite about an hour later, set up our tents, and started a fire. The place was as beautiful as we had hoped. Tall pines surrounded us, and the lake was only a short walk away. As the sun set, we grilled some burgers, cracked open a few beers, and relaxed. It wasn't until late at night that things started to feel off. It began with the feeling of being watched. I can't explain it, but every time I turned toward the trees, I expected to see someone standing there. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. Around midnight, we heard the first noise. A snapping twig, a rustle of leaves. We all went silent, listening. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling our camp. "Probably just an animal," Daniel said, but he didn't sound convinced. Jake shone his flashlight toward the woods, but there was nothing there. Eventually, we shrugged it off and went to bed. I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I lay there, heart pounding, I realized it was real. It was faint, almost like wind through the trees, but there were words I couldn't quite understand. I sat up, listening. The whispering was coming from outside the tent. I reached for my flashlight and unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My breath caught in my throat. There, just beyond the dying embers of our fire, stood a figure. It was Mark. He was standing motionless, staring at our campsite. His face was obscured by the shadows, but I could see his posture, rigid, unnatural. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I zipped the tent back up, trying not to make a sound. I reached over and shook Daniel awake. "Dude," I whispered, "Mark is out there." He blinked groggily. "What?" I pointed to the entrance. "He's standing by the fire pit, just watching us." Daniel's face went pale. He grabbed his flashlight, and we both listened. The whispering had stopped. After a moment, Daniel unzipped the tent and shone the light outside. Mark was gone. Neither of us slept much after that. In the morning, we told Jake and Steve what had happened. They were skeptical at first, but when we searched the campsite, we found footprints in the dirt, large boot prints leading from the woods to our fire pit, and then back into the trees. "Okay, that's creepy as hell," Steve admitted. We debated leaving, but in the end, we convinced ourselves that Mark had just wandered through by accident. Maybe he had gotten lost and was trying to find his way back to the road. We stayed. That night, the whispering returned, and this time it was closer. I woke up to the sound of heavy breathing right outside the tent. Not an animal, human breathing. Slow, raspy, deliberate. I held my breath, terrified. Then, from the other tent, Steve screamed. We scrambled out, flashlights in hand. Steve was standing outside his tent, pale and shaking. "Something was touching the fabric," he stammered. Like fingers dragging across it. We shone our lights around, but Mark was gone. Again, we made a decision then and there. We were leaving. At first light, we packed up and hiked back to the car as fast as we could. When we reached the road, we stopped cold. Sitting on the hood of our car was Mark. He smiled when he saw us, but there was something wrong with it. Something too wide, too forced. "Leaving so soon?" he asked. No one answered. Mark stood up and walked toward us. "I was hoping you'd stay another night." His voice was different now, darker. We didn't wait. We jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped away, leaving Mark standing in the middle of the road, watching us disappear. We never went back to that campsite. And to this day, I don't know who or what Mark really was. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I swear I still hear the whispering. Camping trips were supposed to be relaxing. That's what Jason and Claire had in mind when they packed up their gear, loaded their SUV, and set out for the weekend. They had chosen a secluded spot near an old lake, about 20 miles from the nearest town. It was the perfect escape. No crowds, no cell service, just the two of them and the wilderness. The road leading to the campsite was rough, barely more than a dirt path winding through dense forest. They had to slow down to avoid deep potholes and fallen branches. The farther they drove, the more isolated it felt. It was perfect. After an hour of navigating the uneven terrain, they arrived at a clearing near the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the overcast sky. Jason parked the SUV about 50 feet from where they planned to set up their tent. They spent the afternoon gathering firewood, setting up their campsite, and cooking over an open flame. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped. They huddled close to the fire, roasting marshmallows and talking about life. The occasional hoot of an owl or rustling in the underbrush reminded them they weren't alone, but it felt peaceful, natural. As night deepened, the fire dwindled and exhaustion set in. Jason locked the SUV, making sure everything of value was inside before they crawled into their tent. The night was eerily quiet, save for the gentle lapping of water against the shore. Sleep came quickly. Claire was the first to wake up. The air was crisp, the scent of damp earth filling her lungs. She stretched and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold morning. The campsite was just as they had left it, except something felt off. It took her a few seconds to realize what was missing. The SUV. The spot where it had been parked was empty. Her breath caught in her throat. The ground was undisturbed. No tire tracks, no signs of movement. It was as if the vehicle had vanished into thin air. "Jason," she called, her voice edged with panic. He groggily emerged from the tent, rubbing his eyes. "What's wrong?" She pointed to the empty space. "The car's gone." His expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "What? That's impossible. We locked it. Who would take it?" They ran to the spot, their boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. Jason scanned the area, searching for any clues. There were no drag marks, no footprints leading away. The dirt road they had driven in on was undisturbed. "This doesn't make sense," Claire whispered. Jason tried his phone, but as expected, there was no signal. "We need to get to the main road and flag someone down." They packed their essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a pocket knife. It would be a long walk back to civilization. The forest felt different as they walked, as if the trees had closed in. The road seemed longer, more winding than they remembered. Hours passed, and still, there was no sign of the highway. They took breaks, rationing their water. Jason checked his compass, frowning. "We should have reached the main road by now." Claire's stomach churned. "Do you think we got turned around?" "We followed the road straight," Jason said, though he didn't sound convinced. "Let's keep going." As they trudged forward, something caught Claire's eye through the trees, a glint of metal. "Jason," she whispered, pointing ahead. Through the thick underbrush, they saw it. The SUV. It was parked haphazardly, wedged between two large trees, as if it had been placed there. There were no tire tracks leading to it. The vehicle was locked, just as they had left it. Jason pulled out his keys and unlocked the door. Inside, everything was exactly as they had left it, their belongings untouched. The engine started on the first try. The fuel gauge read the same as the night before. It was as if the car had never moved. Claire's hands trembled as she clutched the dashboard. "Jason, what the hell is going on?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Let's get out of here." They drove in silence, following the road back the way they came. But after an hour, the road didn't lead to the highway. It twisted and turned, doubling back on itself. They were driving in circles. The forest seemed to shift, growing denser. The sky darkened unnaturally, though it was still midday. Claire gripped Jason's arm. "Something is wrong. We need to stop." They pulled over. Jason checked the GPS. It was blank, showing no location. The compass on the dashboard spun erratically. "We're trapped," Claire whispered. Night fell again. They stayed in the car, too afraid to venture outside. The silence was oppressive. Then a sound: soft, deliberate footsteps circling the vehicle. Claire held her breath, peering through the window. In the dim moonlight, figures stood at the tree line, motionless, watching. Jason grabbed the keys. "We're leaving. Now." The figures moved as soon as the engine roared to life. They vanished into the woods, but they could still feel them, just beyond the trees. The car sped down the road, headlights slicing through the darkness. Suddenly, the trees thinned, and they burst onto the highway. They didn't stop driving until they reached a gas station miles away. They sat in the car, hands shaking, unable to speak. When Jason finally looked at the GPS again, their location appeared, exactly where they should have been. The road that had trapped them was gone. They never spoke of it again, but they never went camping after that. Some places don't want you to leave. The plan was simple: a weekend of solitude, camping by the river, and a chance to escape the pressures of work and city life. It had been years since I'd gone on a solo camping trip, and I was determined to make the most of it. The location was a secluded riverbank, far from any marked trails, a spot I had visited once before but never camped at overnight. It was beautiful, tall trees lining the banks, the water slow-moving and deep, and a quiet that only the wilderness could provide. I packed my gear meticulously: a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, fishing equipment, and enough food and water for 2 nights. My plan was to fish for my meals, supplementing what I had brought. After a 3-hour drive and a short hike through the dense forest, I arrived at my spot by mid-afternoon. The place was perfect. The river flowed lazily, its surface rippling slightly under the occasional breeze. The opposite bank was thick with trees, their shadows stretching across the water. It was exactly what I had been craving: peace, quiet, and isolation. I spent the next hour setting up camp, pitching my tent on a flat patch of dirt a few yards from the river's edge. I gathered firewood, arranged my supplies, and made sure everything was secure. With the sun beginning to dip toward the horizon, I decided to cast my fishing line and see if I could catch anything for dinner. The fishing was good. Within an hour, I had caught 2 decent-sized trout. I cleaned them by the water's edge, the scent of fresh fish filling the cool evening air. By the time my small fire was crackling, I was cooking my catch, enjoying the simple pleasure of a meal prepared with my own hands. As I ate, I listened to the sounds of the forest, distant bird calls, the occasional rustling in the underbrush, and the rhythmic flow of the river. It was perfect. As darkness settled, I leaned back against a fallen log and stared up at the sky. The stars were brilliant, unpolluted by city lights. But as I sat there, a strange feeling crept over me. It was subtle at first, just an odd sense of unease. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. I glanced around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. I shook it off. It was probably just my mind playing tricks on me, reacting to the isolation. I banked the fire, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and drifted off to sleep. I woke early, just as the sky was beginning to lighten. The unease from the night before had faded, replaced by excitement for another day of fishing. The river was calm, the air crisp. I set up my gear and cast my line, watching the water as the morning mist rose from its surface. After a few minutes, I felt a tug on my line, strong, insistent. I reeled in, expecting another trout, but something was off. The weight was heavy, unsteady, and as I pulled, I saw something break the surface. At first, I thought it was a large branch caught on my hook, but as I reeled it closer, my stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't a branch. It was a hand. Panic surged through me. The hand was pale, bloated, and lifeless. It was attached to an arm, which led to a body submerged just beneath the surface. The corpse bobbed slightly, face down, tangled in reeds and debris. My fishing hook had caught on the sleeve of a dark, waterlogged jacket. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my rod. My mind raced. How long had it been there? Who was it? How did they end up in the river? I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to stay calm. I needed to call the authorities, but my phone was back at camp. I hesitated, staring at the unmoving figure. I had to be sure of what I was seeing. Grabbing a sturdy branch, I reached out, nudging the body slightly. As I did, it shifted, and the head turned, exposing a swollen, distorted face. The eyes were open, clouded, staring blankly at nothing. A choked gasp escaped my throat as I stumbled back. This wasn't just a random accident. The body had injuries, deep bruises around the neck, a gash along the forehead. Something had happened to this man. I ran back to my camp, grabbed my phone, and tried to call for help. No signal. Of course, this was a remote area. I had hiked for miles to get here. The only way to reach anyone was to leave, hike back to where I had parked, and drive until I got service. I hesitated. If I left now, I wouldn't get back until late afternoon. The thought of leaving the body in the water unsettled me. What if animals got to it? What if the river carried it downstream? But I had no choice. I packed up quickly, stuffing my gear into my backpack. I took one last look at the river. The body was still there, drifting slightly with the current, the lifeless eyes staring up at the gray morning sky. The hike back felt longer than before. Every snap of a twig, Every rustling leaf made my nerves jump. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting someone, or something, to be following me. The air felt heavier, the woods eerily quiet. When I finally reached my car, I jumped inside and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and sped down the dirt road, desperate to find a signal. Finally, a few miles out, my phone pinged with service. I called 911, my voice trembling as I explained what I had found. The dispatcher kept me on the line, asking for details, my location, my name. She told me to stay put and wait for authorities to arrive. Within an hour, 2 sheriff's deputies and a search and rescue team arrived. I led them back to the campsite, my anxiety growing with each step. When we reached the river, my stomach dropped. The body was gone. The water was calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. The deputies exchanged glances. One of them asked if I was sure of what I had seen. I felt my face flush. Yes, I saw him. He was right there. My fishing line caught on his sleeve. They searched the river, sending divers into the water, combing the area for hours. But there was nothing. No body. No evidence. Just the rippling surface of the water, reflecting the afternoon sun. After hours of searching, the sheriff pulled me aside. You said he had injuries? Bruising. I nodded. Yeah, around his neck. A cut on his head, too. The sheriff sighed, rubbing his jaw. If what you saw is real, then we have a bigger problem. Someone might have dumped a body here, and now it's gone. I swallowed hard. Had someone been watching me? Had they come back to move the body before I returned? I left that day, but I never got answers. No body was ever recovered. No missing persons report matched my description. To this day, I don't know what I pulled from that river, but I know one thing. I wasn't alone out there. I don't usually scare easily. I've spent countless nights in the woods, sometimes alone, sometimes with friends. But what happened that night changed the way I see the wilderness forever. It was late September, and my friend James and I had planned a 3-night camping trip in a remote forested area of northern Montana. We both loved the solitude of the backcountry, the kind of places where you could go for days without seeing another soul. The weather was perfect, cool but not too cold. The trees were just starting to turn, and the crisp autumn air made hiking feel effortless. We parked our truck at a trailhead, hoisted our packs onto our shoulders, and started the hike to a secluded valley we had picked out on the map. The plan was to hike about 8 miles in, set up camp by a river, and spend the next couple of days fishing, exploring, and enjoying the wilderness. The hike-in was uneventful. The trail was narrow and winding, cutting through dense pine forests and occasional clearings where we could see the jagged peaks in the distance. By late afternoon, we reached the valley and found a perfect campsite, a flat clearing near the river, surrounded by towering trees. It was quiet, eerily so. We had expected the usual forest sounds, birds, squirrels, the distant howls of coyotes as night fell. But aside from the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind, it was dead silent. James joked about how quiet it was, saying something about how we were probably the only humans for miles. We shrugged it off and went about setting up camp. The sun dipped behind the mountains as we got a fire going, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. That's when it started. At first, it was subtle. A faint whispering sound carried on the wind. It was so soft that I thought it was just the trees rustling. But as the night went on, the whispering became more distinct. It wasn't just the wind. It was voices. James heard it too. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his face illuminated by the firelight. I nodded, straining to listen. It was impossible to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, like a conversation happening just out of earshot. The weird part was that it seemed to be coming from all around us. We grabbed our flashlights and shined them into the woods. Nothing. Just darkness and trees. "Probably just the wind messing with our heads," James muttered, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. Still, we forced ourselves to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia. We put out the fire and climbed into our tents. I lay there for hours, listening, my body tense with unease. The whispers didn't stop. They ebbed and flowed, sometimes close, sometimes distant. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted into a restless sleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. Not to a sound, but to the absence of one. The whispering had stopped. The silence was oppressive, almost unnatural. Then, just as my mind started to relax, I heard it. A single whisper, right outside my tent. My blood ran cold. The voice was so close that I could hear the breath behind it, as if someone was leaning right against the fabric of my tent. I held my breath, my body frozen. I wanted to call out to James, but my voice wouldn't come. Then came the sound of soft footsteps circling the tent. Slow, deliberate. The whispering returned, just as faint as before, but now unmistakably nearby. I finally found my voice. "James," I whispered as loudly as I dared. No answer. I unzipped the tent as quietly as possible and shined my flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. James' tent was still zipped shut. The fire pit was just a pile of glowing embers. The trees swayed gently in the wind, but no one was there. I crawled out, my heart hammering, and moved toward James' tent. "James, wake up." A muffled grunt, then a rustling sound as he unzipped his tent. "What?" he mumbled groggily. "Did you hear that?" He blinked at me, still half asleep. "Hear what?" "The whispers. The footsteps." He frowned, rubbing his eyes. "Dude, I was sleeping. You probably dreamed it." I wanted to believe him, but my gut told me otherwise. Still, standing out there in the dark, knowing I was alone and hearing it, made me feel ridiculous. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind after all. I reluctantly crawled back into my tent, but sleep didn't come easy. The next day, I felt uneasy. James, on the other hand, was his usual self, laughing and joking as we fished in the river and explored the valley. I tried to shake off the night's events, convincing myself that I had overreacted. But as the sun dipped lower, I felt that same dread creeping back. That night, we sat by the fire, talking and eating, when the whispering returned. This time, James heard it clearly. His face lost its humor. "That's not the wind," he whispered. We both listened, frozen. The whispers were surrounding us again, coming from the trees, circling the campsite. But there was something different this time. They were louder, closer, and they weren't alone. Footsteps, soft, shuffling, like bare feet on the forest floor. Then, from the darkness, something echoed back our words. "That's not the wind." James and I bolted upright. He shined his flashlight into the trees. The beam landed on something. A figure, just standing there. It was barely visible, blending into the darkness, but I could make out the shape, tall, human-like, but somehow wrong. The moment the light hit it, the whispering stopped. James swore and took a step back. The figure didn't move. Then, without warning, it melted into the shadows. We didn't stick around. We grabbed our gear in a frenzy, not bothering to pack properly, and hiked out as fast as we could. The entire way back, we felt watched. The whispering followed us, always just out of sight. We reached the truck at dawn, exhausted, shaken, and silent. Neither of us spoke as we drove away. It wasn't until weeks later that I dared to listen to the audio recording on my phone. I had left it on by accident in my tent that second night. Hours of silence, then whispering, and buried beneath the layers of sound, a voice that wasn't mine, repeating my words. "That's not the wind." I deleted the file and never went back to that forest again. I've been hunting and camping alone for years. It's something I do every season, ever since I was old enough to head into the backcountry by myself. There's a peace to it, a kind of solitude you don't find in civilization. Out there, it's just you, the trees, the cold air, and whatever's moving through the underbrush when the sun sets. I've always been comfortable in the wilderness. Until this trip. This was the first time I'd ever felt truly afraid in the woods. I had planned a 5-day hunting trip in the Alaskan wilderness, somewhere between Denali and Wrangell St. Elias. I had been to this particular area before, dense pine forests, rolling hills, and plenty of game. It wasn't an easy spot to reach, which made it perfect. Fewer people meant better hunting, and I preferred to be alone anyway. I drove as far as the forest roads would take me, then hiked the remaining few miles on foot, carrying my gear and rifle. By the time I reached my campsite, it was late afternoon. I chose a small clearing near a stream, surrounded by thick trees but open enough that I could keep an eye on my surroundings. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, built a fire, and hung my food in a bear bag high up in a tree. The sun was setting by the time I sat down to eat, listening to the distant call of an owl. It felt normal, comfortable. That changed later that night. I woke up to the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a noise that woke me, just that uneasy sensation, the kind that sends a chill down your spine even when you're wrapped in a sleeping bag. I stayed completely still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, and the forest was eerily silent. Then I saw them. Two eyes, glowing faintly in the darkness just beyond the tree-line. I've encountered plenty of animals in the wild, but these weren't normal animal eyes. They weren't darting around or blinking like a deer's. They weren't reflecting the light in the way a bear's might. They were still, unmoving, locked onto me. I reached for my rifle. The second my hand moved, the eyes disappeared. Not like an animal retreating in fear, just gone. I stayed awake for another hour, gripping my gun, scanning the woods. Nothing else happened, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. Morning brought some clarity. Maybe it had been a wolf. Wolves can be bold sometimes, though I'd never seen one stare like that before. I shook off the unease, packed my gear, and set out for the day's hunt. I spent hours tracking elk. The terrain was rough, but I was used to it. After a long stalk, I finally took down a young bull just before midday. I field dressed it, packed the meat in my game bags, and started the hike back. The trip back took longer than expected, and by the time I reached camp, the sun was already sinking behind the trees. That's when I saw them. Tracks. Deep, heavy footprints circling my campsite. Not bear prints, not wolf. Human, but too large. Larger than any print I'd ever seen. And they were fresh. Someone, or something, had been here while I was gone. I checked my supplies. Nothing was missing, nothing was disturbed. It was like whoever made those tracks had just been watching. I built my fire bigger that night, keeping my rifle close. The feeling of being watched never left. The third day, I barely left camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I checked my surroundings constantly, scanning the trees, listening for any sound that didn't belong. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I heard it. A low, rhythmic sound. Knocking. Somewhere in the trees, something was knocking on wood. Slow. Deliberate. 3 knocks. Then silence. I stood up, gripping my rifle, straining to hear more. After a few moments, 3 more knocks echoed through the forest, closer this time. My fire crackled. My breath felt too loud. I scanned the tree-line but saw nothing. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep that night. I had planned to stay 5 days, but by the 4th morning, I was done. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. I packed up my supplies, only keeping out what I needed for the hike back. I left just after noon, moving quickly through the trees. I had made it about 3 miles when I felt it again, that suffocating sense of being watched. I turned slowly, gripping my rifle, and there they were. The eyes. Not just 2 this time. 4. Then 6. All glowing faintly in the thick shadows of the trees. All motionless. All watching. I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears. I felt a bead of sweat slide down my temple despite the cold air. Then, one of the sets of eyes blinked. That broke whatever hold fear had on me. I turned and ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, not caring about the noise, not caring about exhaustion. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs screamed in protest. Only when I saw my truck did I finally stop, gasping for breath, heart hammering against my ribs. I threw my gear inside, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't know who or what made those tracks, or what was knocking in the trees. What I do know is that I will never return to that place. There are things in the wild that we don't understand, things that don't belong. And some things, whatever they are, watch from the dark, waiting. I've always preferred to camp alone. The solitude of the wilderness, the absence of modern distractions, the complete self-reliance. It's something I've found both peaceful and necessary. Some people find comfort in company, but for me, there's nothing quite like being deep in the woods with only my thoughts and the sounds of nature. That was before I met the man in the woods. I had planned this trip for weeks, 4 days in a secluded part of the forest, miles from any marked trails. I had hiked this area before, but I was venturing deeper this time, hoping to find a new favorite spot. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off, shouldered my pack, and started the long hike in. The first few miles were uneventful, just the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the forest floor. The sun was high, filtering through the towering pines. Birds called to one another, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. It was perfect. By mid-afternoon, I found a clearing that looked promising. A small stream trickled nearby, and the trees formed a natural barrier around most of the site. It felt secluded, safe. I dropped my pack and set up my tent, collecting firewood as the sun dipped lower in the sky. That evening, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and soaking in the quiet. The woods can be eerie at night, but I had done this enough times to ignore the distant rustling of nocturnal creatures. Still, there was something off about the silence that night. It felt heavier, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook off the thought and crawled into my tent, falling asleep to the soft crackling of the dying fire. The next morning, I woke with the first light, feeling well-rested. I stretched, unzipped my tent, and stepped outside, inhaling the crisp morning air. Then I saw it. Sitting on a log by my fire pit was a small wooden carving. I froze. It was rough, made from a thick branch, and shaped into a crude human figure. It hadn't been there the night before. Someone had placed it there while I slept. My stomach tightened. I wasn't alone. I scanned the clearing, my eyes darting between the trees, but I saw nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been near my camp. Just the carving, sitting there like an offering. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The edges were splintered, roughly whittled with what looked like a dull knife. My first instinct was that maybe it was a joke, a fellow camper messing with me. But I hadn't seen or heard anyone for miles. The smart move would have been to leave. But I had planned this trip, and I wasn't going to let some weird little figurine scare me off. I set it down, convinced myself it was nothing, and went about my day. The second night, I couldn't shake the unease. The forest was too quiet. The usual sounds, chirping insects, distant howls, seemed muted. I kept my fire burning longer than usual, sitting up late, listening. At some point, I must have dozed off by the fire because I woke suddenly to a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, just beyond the glow of the fire. I didn't move. My pulse pounded in my ears. The steps circled my camp, crunching softly in the underbrush. I gripped my knife, my breath shallow. The footsteps weren't heavy, not like an animal's. They were careful, human. I forced myself to turn my head, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Then they stopped. I stayed awake for hours, listening, waiting. But there was nothing. No retreating steps, no sudden movement. It was as if whoever, or whatever, had been there had simply vanished into the trees. When the first hints of dawn lightened the sky, I forced myself to move. I checked the perimeter of my camp. No footprints. No broken branches. But when I turned back toward the fire pit, I saw something that sent a shiver down my spine. Another carving. This one closer to my tent. I packed up within minutes of sunrise. I wasn't staying another night. Whatever was out there had been getting bolder, and I wasn't about to find out what happened if I stayed any longer. The hike back felt different. The forest, once welcoming, now felt oppressive. The trees loomed taller. The air was heavier, and that feeling of being watched never left me. Halfway back to my truck, I saw him. A figure stood among the trees, just off the trail. Too far to make out details, but close enough that I could see he was watching me. He didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there. I gripped my knife and forced myself to keep walking, never breaking pace. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel his presence long after I lost sight of him. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my pack into the bed, locked the doors, and sped off down the dirt road. My hands were shaking the entire drive home. I don't know who he was. I don't know how long he had been watching me. But I do know this. I wasn't supposed to be there. That place, those woods, they weren't mine. And whoever was out there made sure I knew it. I've always been an easygoing traveler, the kind of person who doesn't plan too much. That's why this trip seemed perfect. Just a group of friends, the open road, and a week to explore the wilderness. We had planned to drive cross-country, stopping at various national parks and camping along the way. No reservations, no set plans, just adventure. There were 4 of us, me, Chris, David, and Emily. We had been friends since college, and this was supposed to be our big reunion trip. We packed everything we needed: tents, food, water, a portable stove, enough to stay off the grid for days at a time. Everything was going smoothly until we stumbled across that campsite. I still don't know what was wrong with it, only that something was. It was the 4th night of our trip. We had spent the day hiking in a national park, but by the time evening rolled around, we realized we had miscalculated our distance from the nearest designated campground. Rather than backtracking, Chris suggested we find a spot on public land, somewhere we could camp legally without worrying about permits. Emily pulled up an old camping forum on her phone and found a mention of a free site just off a dirt road about 15 miles from where we were. The post was vague, just a single line. Good spot, quiet, some old fire pits. There were no pictures, no reviews, but it was late, and we didn't feel like driving for hours to find another place. When we arrived, it was nearly dark. The road leading in was rough, barely a trail, with thick trees pressing in from both sides. Our headlights bounced off trunks and undergrowth, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. When we finally reached the clearing, it was bigger than we expected. Plenty of space for tents, a fire pit made of stacked stones, and signs that others had camped there before. But there was something off about it. The place felt abandoned, but not in the usual way. It wasn't just empty, it felt left behind. Like whoever had last stayed here had left in a hurry. The fire pit was filled with ash, but no fresh wood or signs of recent use. There was an old folding chair near the edge of the clearing, its fabric torn, but it hadn't collapsed from age. It had been slashed. Emily was the first to say something. "This place gives me weird vibes." Chris laughed. "It's a campsite in the middle of nowhere. It's supposed to be creepy." David nodded. "It's fine. Let's just set up and get a fire going." None of us argued. It was late, and we were exhausted, but the unease lingered. We set up our tents in a semicircle near the fire pit. Emily and I shared one tent, while Chris and David took another. The fire crackled, and after a few drinks, we started to relax. The stars were brilliant, the air crisp, and for a while, it felt like any other camping trip. Then, sometime after midnight, we heard it. A sound in the woods. A slow, deliberate rustling, like someone moving through the undergrowth. We all froze. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak orange light across the clearing. Chris grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the trees. "Nothing. Probably a deer," David whispered. None of us fully believed that, but we didn't want to admit it. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, and we tried to sleep. I lay awake for hours, listening. Every so often, I swore I heard something, a branch snapping, a soft shuffle of dirt. But when I peeked out of the tent, the clearing was empty. Morning came, cold and gray. I was relieved to be awake, ready to pack up and leave, but as soon as Emily unzipped the tent, she sucked in a sharp breath. "What the hell?" she whispered. I leaned over her shoulder and felt my stomach drop. Handprints. Dozens of them, all over the tent fabric, smeared into the thin layer of condensation that had formed overnight. Small, dirty prints, like a child's hands had pressed against the surface. Emily scrambled out of the tent. I followed, heart pounding. The others were already outside, staring at the ground. The dirt around our tents was covered in prints, not boot prints, not animal tracks, just handprints. Some of them trailed toward the trees, fading into the undergrowth. Chris turned in a slow circle, scanning the clearing. "This is messed up. Who the hell would do this?" David muttered. None of us had an answer. We packed up in record time. Nobody said it out loud, but we all had the same thought. Someone had been here last night, watching, touching our tents while we slept. But as we threw our gear into the car, something else caught my eye. Beyond the clearing, in the trees, there were more chairs. Old, weathered, broken camping chairs, half hidden in the undergrowth. At least a dozen of them, scattered between the trees, facing our campsite, like a silent audience. We didn't say a word as we got in the car and left. None of us talked much on the drive back to the highway. The mood had shifted. What was supposed to be a fun, carefree trip now felt tainted. Emily broke the silence first. "Do you think it was a prank?" Chris shook his head. "Who would do that? And why? No cars, no other campsites nearby. We're miles from anything." David exhaled sharply. "Maybe it's just a weird place." That was the closest we got to an explanation. Weeks later, I tried to look up the site again. The forum post was gone. I searched maps, trip reports, anything that might explain what we saw. But I found nothing. It was like the place had never existed. We never went back.